Okay, so this is what I call part 2 of chapter 8. We'll talk about inflation. Now, we already started talking about inflation in, excuse me, let me move this up a little bit. In chapter 7, right, when we introduced the consumer price index and the calculations of that. And there'll be a little bit of that in this chapter, but most of this chapter's discussion of inflation is the consequences of inflation. Rather than the mechanics of calculating it. Okay. So when I say consequences of inflation, inflation can cause a lot of pain, right? And cause people a lot of pain. Probably not, you know, if you're for a traditional college-age student in 2020, probably not. It probably hasn't caused you much pain because inflation has been really, really low over the last really 12 years or more. But in periods of very high inflation, it causes people to have to change their behavior, change their incentives, right? If inflation is enough or high enough, as this describes, it discourages people from holding on to cash because that cash loses its value. And if you're holding on to cash rather than spending your money or having it in stocks and bonds, which hopefully is growing at a rate faster than inflation, then people can, in extreme cases, people can stop using cash altogether. And what's pictured here is a case from history of incredibly fast inflation, right? And I could go through this YouTube clip, which I would encourage you to do because it has some pretty amazing anecdotes of what people would do because prices were going up so fast after World War I in Germany that someday inflation was 100% every 3 days for some period of time, right? So currency got so useless that here's a woman heating her house with currency, right, rather than wood because it was cheaper. There's another anecdote in the documentary, like people were paid with suitcases full of money because the currency had lost so much of its value. And there was one anecdote she gave where, someone had left their suitcases of money on the street, and they, for a second, they came back, and the thief had stolen the suitcases but left the money, and that's literally, it was that bad. But even in more recent times in Venezuela, inflation has gone as high as 8,000% per year, as opposed to the 2% or less that we've experienced over the last decade in the United States. And I actually heard a discussion on the radio about a professor who was working there who didn't keep their money in cash, right, because they stopped using it altogether because it was so useless. Literally, it was safer for them to put their money, once they made it, into Bitcoin, right? So as an example. Now, what are some of the costs of inflation, especially as it starts getting higher than a couple of percent per year? Well, one of the things economists often call the shoe leather cost, right? So increased costs of transactions because cash loses its value if it loses it very quickly. People have to run around spending it, so it's not literally true anymore so much, right? Because everything's electronic for the most part. But that's the idea, right? So you got to run around and spend your money before it's gone. So that's why it's historically called shoe leather costs. Menu costs, which is literally, it often costs companies a lot of money to change their prices. And menu cost is such a great name for that, because if you go to a sit-down restaurant, right, and it has a nice printed menu, you can picture, hey, if they have to change their prices, they have to print the new menu. So that's why it's called menu costs. Now, menu costs have gotten smaller over time as most prices are listed online, but for a restaurant, a nice sit-down restaurant that prints their menu, it'd still be true. Like go to your diner with that book of different things you can buy. If they have to reprint the menu, that's an expensive proposition. But all kinds of different costs of changing prices. Unit of account costs, right? So basically, if there's enough inflation, right, money becomes a less reliable way to measure how much something costs. We'll talk in chapter 14 more about this whole idea of unit, what something that's used as money has to do well to be able to be effective at being money. But one of the things is it's the measure that we use to price things. Well, if the purchasing power of money is going down quickly because of inflation, then from day to day, week to week, month to month, pricing it in dollars wouldn't work very well. So that's kind of what it's called. So it's hard. Calculations get hard when there's a lot of inflation. And on a more real sense, if you have a portfolio of stocks and bonds and that goes up in value by 10%, well, that's 10% in what we'll call nominal terms, right? Not adjusted for inflation. But if inflation is also 10%, right? Your stocks and bonds go up in value by 10%, but inflation, prices of things went up in the same year by 10%. You didn't really earn anything, right? Your real return on your stocks and bonds was zero after inflation, but it actually becomes negative because you're not taxed on that inflation adjusted return. You're taxed on literally the 10% nominal return. So you would actually have a negative return because of that. So the higher the inflation is, the more of a penalty there is in paying taxes on like for example, capital gains, right? The value of your stocks and bonds going up. So we did a bunch of this already, the pure calculation in the last chapter, right? So the price, like any percentage change, which is what inflation is, price level in the second year minus the first year divided by the first year is how much inflation happened between the years. And as a reminder, right, consumer price index, which is what we studied in chapter 7, is not inflation itself, but it's used to calculate inflation. So if the consumer price index went up from 120 to 135 over 1 year, you'd use this formula to calculate the rate of inflation as 12.5%. So obviously from the last chapter and from this one, you need to make sure you can do those calculations. So imagine that you have an employment contract that's pegged to inflation, which is one of the things we talked about in chapter 7, that some employment contracts do have a COLA, often called cost of living adjustment. So if the CPI goes up from 110 to 112 and your salary is $30,000 before the increase, what would your new salary be? And you basically do the same calculation on that 110 to 112, and you would see that your new salary is in fact $30,545. And I'll let you kind of do that calculation on your own to check that math. So it's just math, right? Make sure you know how to do that math. Okay. Now, economists, and actually Federal Reserve has been talking about these ideas lately, but economists often distinguish or differentiate between anticipated inflation, inflation that we expect to happen, and unanticipated inflation, inflation that's different than what we expect. Right? The Federal Reserve has up until this, middle of 2020, tried to create the expectation that inflation would be somewhere around 2% per year in the United States, because that's what their target is. And if it is that, that's pretty much what people expect. On average, prices going up. And if that's what keeps happening, then especially at those types of very low levels, there's not a ton of other types of costs, or a ton of any of these types of costs that I just went over, because 2% per year typically wouldn't make people change their behavior, or doesn't really impact shoe leather costs in any meaningful way. Restaurants can wait a couple of years probably to change their menus. There is a bit of a return on investment hit from having to pay from nominal returns, but not so huge as to make people likely change their behavior. But if inflation is different than anticipated, then it doesn't take huge levels of inflation to create winners and losers, to make some people better off because that inflation was different than anticipated, and some people worse off. And you need to kind of understand who becomes better off, who becomes worse off. So because anticipated inflation is, well, by definition anticipated, you expect it to happen, on average, most people's wages, on average, have risen at least as fast as inflation. Right? So assuming that your salary goes up by 2%, absent promotions, just as a normal kind of raise per year, and inflation is 2%, then you basically can buy the same amount of stuff, right? You keep up with inflation. And that's often how people, when they have their jobs and they get their salary increases each year, again, forgetting promotions and the like, people recognize they're falling behind if it doesn't keep up with the cost of living, i.e. inflation. Now, it used to be, I had to change this slide kind of now, right? It used to be that I used to say it at normal times. I think we're hitting a new normal. It used to be that nominal interest rates, right, short-term interest rates, for example, the interest rate you earn on money in a savings account, it used to be that interest rate was enough to keep up for inflation. So it would have a positive real return, right? So maybe you earn 3%, you used to be able to earn 3% on your money in your savings account if inflation was 2%. It's not exactly the math, but 3 minus the 2, you earn like a real return of 1%. But that's not true anymore, and it actually hasn't been true for over a decade. And now with the COVID-19 recession, it's unlikely that it's going to be true anytime in the next, at least 5 years. Because even when I said the idea of saving 3% on a savings account, most of you probably said, what the hell is that? Right? Most of you have never earned more than 1% on a savings account. And I imagine, haven't looked lately, but I imagine it's closer to 0 again since the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates again. So real return on short-term investments is negative, right? Even 10-year government treasury bonds, which a lot of people hold, those are earning less than 1% per year now. If inflation is 2%, again, that's a negative return on investment. Okay. So back to the wages thing. So although a lot of people's wages at least rise fast enough to keep up with inflation, some people's don't. And if they do, they're losing to inflation. And this is particularly true for some people on fixed incomes, not for Social Security, right? Because one thing we talked about last in Chapter 7 is that Social Security monthly benefits increase each year by inflation. But my mother's been collecting my father's pension, right, from IBM. That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed since my father retired decades ago. So the amount, the value, the purchasing power of what she's collecting keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And low-income individuals, on average, have been losing to inflation as a group, right, over the last 40 years. We talked a little bit about minimum wage in the last chapter, which is federal minimum wage, $7.25, been that for the last 11 years. So not everybody, even for anticipated inflation, is doing okay, but a lot of people are doing all right, for anticipated inflation. Right, and for New York, for example, the minimum wage is increasing, and for many other states. But what I started that discussion with is, well, when there's unanticipated inflation, it doesn't have to be very high, and it can still create, again, winners and losers. So many contract with interest rates, right, with or raises, right, cost of living adjustment that aren't recalibrated every year based on whatever the level of inflation is. Well, those longer term contracts require an estimate of expected inflation for the future to figure out what interest rate or percentage increase to make. And I'll use my recently expired or contract at Dutchess Community College. There were other things, other adjustment each year for longevity, but each year the salary schedules, right, increased by about 2% per year, and I was part of setting that or negotiating that back in 2015 before this contract. And the idea was, okay, well, those salary schedules better move up at least by inflation, otherwise we're going to be falling behind. I actually kind of started giving away the answer to the question I'm about to ask. But let's imagine that the next contract, if we could be so lucky, although probably not, let's assume the next contract gives the same increases in the salary schedules by 2% per year, with, again, the expectation that inflation will be 2% per year. So again, that was when it was created, with that expectation. Federal Reserve kind of says that. So if inflation is lower or higher than that expected, this employment contract is going to have winners and losers. Right? So who wins, who loses? And the choice is really, does the faculty and staff union at DCC win if inflation is 5% a year as opposed to the expected 2%? Or do they lose? Do we lose? Well, we lose because our salaries are going up by 2% because we expected that to be enough to keep up with inflation. But if costs of things actually go up by 5%, we're basically losing 3% per year, right? The difference between the actual inflation rate and our cost of living adjustment, basically. So our wages aren't keeping up with inflation, so we're being able to buy less and less with our money. The college's financial picture, however, would likely be a bit of a beneficiary from at least this employment contract with this unanticipatedly high inflation. And why is that? Because they would probably be able to justify raising your tuition each year a little bit more, because that's set on more on a yearly basis as opposed to like this 4-year contract. So if they could raise the tuition to cover the inflation, they wouldn't have to pay our piece of our contract, at least until the next contract negotiations, for this unanticipatedly high inflation. So the college would kind of be a winner. And sorry about that. Someone was texting me if you heard that. But anyway. All right, then another place that you need to kind of be able to think through and analyze who would be winners and losers from inflation are borrowers and lenders. Right? So interest rate is obviously the annual amount that you have to pay to borrow money if you're borrowing, and the annual amount, the percentage amount that the bank makes if they're lending you money. And the nominal interest rate is basically what that is. So if you're borrowing money for a car at 5% interest, well, that's nominal interest. It's not inflation adjusted. It's what you're actually paying on the loan and what the bank is earning on the loan. However, the real interest rate is basically the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So keeping 2% as our expected inflation, if they're willing to lend you money at 5% and inflation is expected to be 2%, then what the real interest rate they're expecting to earn on lending you money for that car is the 5% minus that they're actually getting from you minus the 2% they know they're losing to inflation, or a 3% real interest rate. Well, if inflation is higher than expected, again, let's say instead of being 2%, it's, let's call it 6%. Who wins? Does the borrower, who has already made that loan? So again, this is inflation happens after the loan is made. Is that beneficial for the borrower, or is it beneficial for the lender? Well, if inflation is actually 6% per year, let's say it's a 5-year car loan, for each of those years after you borrow at 5%, well, you're winning, right? Because if they had lent it to you later after the inflation, they would have probably charged you more. But as was discussed earlier here, actually not there, here, on average, good chance your wages are going to rise faster because of that inflation to kind of make up for that inflation. But your loan payment's not gonna, right? Your loan payment's not going to increase. So you're going to be paying off the loan with effectively cheaper and cheaper money, right? We'll pay off the loan with money with a lower real value than expected. So you're better off as the borrower, having locked in that 5% interest, which they lent to you at assumed real 6% interest rate. But for the lender, right, if the nominal interest rate they're collecting from you is 5%, but inflation is 6%, they're actually earning a negative real 1% per year interest on lending you money. Not a great deal for them. Okay, so the last thing about inflation and deflation, or inflation, is actually talking about the opposite, the prices of things going down. So often people wonder, okay, so the Federal Reserve is charged with keeping prices stable or keeping inflation low, but they target 2% and perhaps even a little bit more lately, but we won't get into that at this moment, rather than 0. Well, why don't they target 0? Well, it turns out from a macroeconomic standpoint, most economists would consider a little bit of deflation, prices of things going down, actually more dangerous than a little bit of inflation. So why is that the case? Well, it's kind of an iterative process. So let's think about it. So if people expect prices to fall in the future, right? So they anticipate deflation, if that's what's expected, well, they may delay purchases, right? Why buy something today if you can delay it and have it be cheaper and buy it tomorrow, right? So expected prices going down, so they might delay purchases. Companies might delay building factories, right? Because there's less of a return on investment, because by the time they're selling the cars, the value of the cars likely has gone down that they're going to sell in the future. That whole idea of being able to pay back a loan with money that is cheaper, right, when there's anticipated inflation, when you take out a 30-year mortgage, by the time you're making the 30th year of payments with 2% inflation per year, you're paying that back with much cheaper money. But if inflation is actually expected to be deflation, right, it's actually making you worse off. So this can kind of create an iterative feedback loop, and so people expect prices to fall, they delay purchases, companies delay making factories, that slows down the economy, which firms lay off more people, and it kind of creates a downward spiral, often delaying economic recoveries and often leading to stagnant economy, which for a lot of the 90s, right, and even into 2000s, was basically true in Japan, largely because of this type of reason. And that's about it for this chapter.